The Weimar Republic, spanning 1919 to 1933, was a dramatic period in the life of Germany and the life of Europe as a whole. It witnessed constant changes in society. The Deutschmark fluctuated like a yo-yo, and political figures exited stage right as quickly as they had entered stage left. Weimar itself became a theatre. Weimar was a silver screen. And during the 1920s, dramatic disciplines flourished, holding up a mirror to the unfolding events.
A powerful means of commenting on the events and the characters of the Weimar Republic was the medium of cabaret, and it absolutely thrived in the German capital between the wars.
The importance of cabaret, and the interesting thing about it, was that it was absolutely central to Berlin's social and artistic life. And it had a very, very strong gay and lesbian element to it. There were many, many songs, some sung by gay artists, some by straight artists, some were satirical. Cabaret was very important in Germany as a form of protest. It was partly social protest about conditions that people were living in. It was political protest. There was protest against almost anything you'd care to mention. But of course, it was all done in the form of entertainment with witty songs and lyrics. And that is sort of captured in the film Cabaret to some extent.
Not everyone in Germany responded with enthusiasm to the cabaret scene and its wild sexual, political and social mix.
Berlin transformed itself into the Babel of the world. Germans brought to perversion all their vehemence and love of system. Made-up boys with artificial waistlines promenaded along the Kurfürstendamm. Even Rome had not known orgies like the Berlin transvestite balls, where hundreds of men in women's clothes and women in men's clothes danced under the benevolent eyes of the police.
Well, the experience of going to a cabaret would have been not unlike the film Cabaret, but it would have been a great deal more dingy. The cabaret artiste, it was much more about putting a song across than singing in tune. I mean, even Dietrich wavers between octaves when she's singing some of those songs, and Claire Waldorf had the most incredible gravelly voice. It was important the words could be heard, and often that meant speaking them more than singing them. So it was a bit rough and ready, but it's like any sort of agitprop. That idea that you're putting something across, though in a way that will entertain people. So it was to do with wit and style, and you would have things like someone coming on in a costume half man, half woman, and singing about how confused we are about the genders. That was a very famous cabaret act, and he stood in front of two doors, one with men on and one with women. It was all pretty rough and ready.
The demi-monde dominion of cabaret didn't only flourish in its own right during the Weimar Republic, it also had a huge impact on other types of drama, like opera and music theatre. Cabaret's stripped-down aesthetic, its coarser style of singing, an unyielding focus on the down at heel may seem anathema to the gilt and glamour of the opera house, but that's precisely what the centuries-old form needed, a modern shot in the arm. And that is where Kurt Weill came in.
This evening you will see an opera for beggars. Because this opera was conceived so splendidly, as only beggars would imagine it, and because it still had to be so cheap that beggars could afford it, it is called the Threepenny Opera.
The Threepenny Opera stepped away from the opera house. First seen in a theatre with rudimentary sets and a small pit band, it eschewed the lavish aesthetic of German opera from Wagner to Richard Strauss. Instead, Kurt Weill fused the barbed, speech-singing style of cabaret and the rhythms of jazz, newly imported from America, to create its unique sound world.
Kurt Weill's collaboration with Bertolt Brecht was one of the most important of the 20th century.
It was the new era, the new kind of theatre, new kinds of problems. Brecht had a concept of alienation as a very central concept of his theatrical thinking, which means that at every second, it is clear to the audience that this is theater. So theater is not trying to imitate life, but more comment on life. And there's no attempt to create an illusion. And Kurt Weill was the perfect composer for this kind of concept because his music alienates things even further. There are waltzes and there are polkas and there are marches, and he moves quite freely between very lyrical, very tragic expression and then completely raucous music hall.
Having begun his career as a busker, Brecht became the Weimar Republic's principal artistic agitator. Didactic, dictatorial, Brecht used the stage as a mirror, and he didn't limit his focus to the theatre.
Brecht was mistrustful of film as an illusionist, escapist medium, but he was also fascinated by cinema as a popular art form which challenged traditional forms of culture. Brecht was fascinated by Charlie Chaplin. He adored him, and he especially admired his style of acting, which was the kind of thing he was aiming for in his own epic theatre. But there were two important feature films with which Brecht was directly involved during the Weimar Republic. The first was Pabst's film adaptation of the Threepenny Opera, which had been an international sensation. During the couple of years that had elapsed since the stage premiere and the film deal being signed, the political and economic situation had changed considerably, it had darkened, and Brecht had become more deeply involved in Marxist studies. He'd always feared a bit that the successful stage hit was too entertaining and enjoyable to be truly subversive, and he saw the film now as an opportunity to deliver a much more hard-hitting critique of capitalism. Its aesthetics, its narrative fluidity and atmospheric visuals are rather different from his aesthetic, but surprisingly, perhaps, the film actually incorporates some of his proposed radical changes, including the very subversive ending where the gangsters turn themselves into respectable bankers, thus equating capitalism and crime. The film is really a marvelous mixture of incisive wit and scathing criticism that manages also to be aesthetically engaging. Weimar cinema was a cinema of dazzling spectacle, and scenes of hedonistic display in nightclubs and variety theatres and wild parties are still one of the things that most attract us to the German films of this period. Sternberg's The Blue Angel, made in 1930, wasn't the very first German sound film, but it was the most lavish, prestigious sound film production to date, and it was hailed as a breakthrough in the new medium of sound technology. It managed to combine natural-sounding speech with an inventive, imaginative use of sound effects and very catchy songs, which became instant hits. It's the tale of an elderly, uptight, sexually repressed schoolmaster who succumbs to the charms of a wildly unsuitable woman who's called Lola Lola, the chanteuse star attraction of a seedy dive called The Blue Angel. Lola Lola was the breakthrough role of an amazing talent, Marlene Dietrich. It catapulted her to international stardom and launched her collaboration in Hollywood with Sternberg. They produced together a further 6 films, which would go down in film history. Critics and audiences immediately recognized Dietrich as a new kind of female screen presence, a raunchy, humorous, down-to-earth sort of woman, totally at ease with herself and very confident in her erotic power.
Ich bin die Fische Lola, der Liebling liebling der Saison. Ich habe ein Pianola zu Haus in mein Salon. Ich bin die fesche Lola, mich liebt ein jedermann. Doch an mein Pianola, da lässt sich keiner dran.
The interaction of these artistic disciplines, cabaret, opera, theatre, film, meant that the Weimar Republic became a period of extraordinary artistic cross-pollination. Just listen to Alban Berg's opera Lulu, and the impact of cinema and jazz is immediately apparent. But the art produced wasn't only reflective of itself, it was also reflective of the society that became its subject, a society in flux. And the composers of the Weimar Republic provided its soundtrack, just as many of them would when they fled the regime that came in its wake, forcing them to find new pastures on Broadway and in Hollywood.
Ich bin die fesche Lola, der Liebling der Saison. Ich habe ein Pianola zu Hause in mein Salon. Ich bin die fesche Lola, mich liebt ein jedermann. Doch an mein Pianola, da lässt sich keiner dran.